in the Gospel of John, and the overall book is this invitation to come and see. Come and see who Jesus is, and when we come and see who Jesus is, we're seeing who God is. We happened upon a bookstore this past week, and I'm always drifting towards the spirituality and self-help and meaning and purpose sections just to see what's out there. And it's what everybody is seeking to find. Who is God? Why are we here? What is purpose? And so the Gospel of John is this invitation to come and see Jesus, see who he is and what he has accomplished. And what we see here in the back half of chapter 5, or kind of in the middle of chapter 5, is this declaration that Jesus is God, that Jesus is equal with God. One commentator called it Jesus' divinity sermon. It's the clearest picture of how Jesus is God. And Jesus gives this what they call a discourse or a disclosure of who he really is. He's very plain and he's very clear that he is God. And what we'll see from chapter 5 on, and this declaration of Jesus that he is God, if you notice in the first 4 chapters, there were some people that had some questions for Jesus. Well, what about this and what about this? And then they find life, and it was all going really smooth, and it was really fun. But now we start seeing Jesus face opposition. Because what he was doing, what he was saying, when he is saying he was God, he would have been committing blasphemy to the Jewish leaders of this time, because it's monotheistic. There is one God. And then also it says here in verse 18 that he would have been breaking the Sabbath. And those were 2 things that could get you stoned, that would get you killed in that time. And so that's why it says, well, they wanted to kill him. They're asking, who does Jesus think he is? And Jesus is declaring, I am God. He's disclosing himself as God. I've been talking to you guys. This past week, we got an impromptu trip to New York City, which was awesome. It was like fly in Tuesday, fly out Thursday evening. And so it was a little answer to prayer, because I was like, man, it'd be awesome just to get up there for a short weekend and just some time with Karina and enjoy it. So long story short, we were able to get up there. And it was, I've been there, it's probably about 15 or 20 years ago. But flying into Newark, into New Jersey, you're flying in. And I remember looking at my watch, it was like 1:19. And we're flying, and then it was like 1:20, 1:21, 1:22. It was like 3 minutes, and you're still flying past the city. It's still going on. It's this big and expansive and impressive city. I remember driving and seeing the city for the first time. I was like, when does this sucker end? Right? And you just see how big and powerful and strong it is. But it's also kind of vague. You don't really see it. You just see these buildings. You see this skyline. You don't see it in its entirety. But when you drive into the city, right, it becomes clearer. Like, oh, look, the Statue of... Oh, look, the Empire State Building. Oh, look, the Freedom Tower. As you drive in, it becomes clearer. And then what I was most excited about with this trip, we didn't have a huge agenda. It was just walking around. There's all these neighborhoods that I read about, or I have friends that are pastors in these areas. And I was like, and so I'm learning from these guys. I want to see hey, what is this? What are these areas? And so the goal for me on this trip was to spend time with Karina and just walk around, to experience the city. And when you walk around, when you're in the city, you really begin to see it. It becomes clearer. You see the true height of the buildings when you stand right next to them. You try and take a picture and fit the whole thing in there. You see the beauty of the architecture. You don't see these just random buildings that are sort of far away. And when you're in it, you see the real heartbeat of the city. You see and experience the people. It was fascinating. I think I maybe listened to too many people and what their opinion of New York City was. I'll get to this at the end of the sermon. But people were super engaging. They were super welcoming. They were super nice. They loved their city. They were in conversation. And as I walked through the city, you begin to really see what it's about. you see its real beauty, its real vibrancy. You see its real life. And in this passage, what we see, if God is like the city when you're flying in, right? When you think of the idea of God, he's expansive, he's powerful, he's majestic, he's overwhelming, and you can see it, but he's hard to fully understand, right? When you just think of God in nebulous terms. What's going on here, and what's going on with Jesus, is he makes God clear. He takes the impressive, the overwhelming, the holy, the glory, the majesty, the things that we make up words because there's no words to fully encapsulate them. Jesus makes God clear. Jesus makes God more understandable. Jesus reveals the true heartbeat of God. And that's what we see in this passage. That's what we see in Jesus. Jesus saying, I am God, and I've come to show you who God is, to show you what God is like, to show you what God is all about. He's saying, I'm God. And if you want to know this God, you have to know me. And in this passage, what we'll see is Jesus, again, it's a discourse or a disclosure. He discloses God through his actions. He's saying, if you want to know what God does, watch me. Jesus discloses God as the giver of life. He's the one that gives life to all things. And then the last thing we see in this passage is that Jesus discloses God through executing judgment. That Jesus brings judgment. Jesus is going to set all things right. It's what God is about. God is about making things right. So first, we see in verse 19 to 20, Jesus discloses God through his actions, what he does. Look at verse 19. It says, so Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing, his actions. So for whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. Jesus reveals what God is about. We've been seeing this all throughout the book of John. God is about love. For God so loved the world. God is all about restoration. What did we see last week? He's healing people. He's restoring people. He's making things right. God is all about flourishing, right? Remember in the wedding at Cana, what did they do? They ran out of wine. They got in a pinch. They got in a pickle. And what did Jesus do? He provides wine. He brings flourishing. He brings wholeness. He sets things right. We've seen that God is about new life. He is restoring and bringing new life. We saw it last week with the official son who was sick. Kent Hughes put it this way. He says, if we want to see what the Father does, if you want to see what God is up to, what God is doing in the world that he created, all we have to do is look at Christ. So you want to know what God is about? You want to know what God is up to in the world? Look at Jesus. Look at what Jesus is about. Look at what Jesus is up to in the world, and you know what God is about. And I like this because Hughes takes it a step further, and he says, okay, if that's true, if we want to know what God is about, he says, we must daily, I just like this word, we must daily appropriate the reality that Jesus is God. We must daily appropriate. We must daily live in light of Jesus being God. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That must be a constant reality in our life. If you want to know what the Father is about, you want to know what the Father does, we look at Jesus. And we don't just look at him, we dwell on it, we think about it, we appropriate it, we live in light of it. And for me, it spurred a couple questions. Do we live with the confidence, with the assurance, with the peace that comes from knowing that Jesus is at work? Whatever the Father is doing, I am doing. Jesus is at work. Do we live with that confidence? Do we live with that assurance? Do we live with that peace in the midst of whatever circumstances we're going through, good or bad? Do we really believe that Jesus is at work in and through all things? Romans 8:28. For we know that for those that love God, all things are working together for good. Do we live in light of that? Or are we so swayed by our circus, so swayed by our challenges, that's what we live in light of? Knowing that Jesus is God and that he is doing what the Father does gives us assurance, gives us confidence, gives us peace. And when we have that confidence and assurance and we have that peace, we begin to look to Jesus to know how to live. Right? If in Jesus we see what God is like,